Okay, criminology. So today we move on to chapter 9. This week we move on to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is titled Psychosocial Theories, Individual Traits, and Criminal Behavior. In this chapter, remember, as usual, as in other chapters, there are some learning objectives that you guys need to be able to take away. You can find these learning objectives on our Blackboard website, and you can find them right at the beginning of chapter 9. I'm not going to go into them. However, again, at the end of completing your tasks for the week, so that's reading the textbook, maybe watching the lecture, completing the discussion board, go back to the learning objectives and quiz yourself, okay? What are psychosocial theories? Okay, how does temperament play a role in the development or the formation of one's personality, etc.? Okay, so I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to get right into the lecture this week, and let's begin, okay? So first, I want to start off with the great pillars of psychology. This is right at the beginning of chapter 9, the 2 great pillars of psychology. So psychosocial theories of criminal behavior are more interested in individual differences in the propensity to commit crimes than in environmental conditions that may push a person into committing a crime. So in other words, psychosocial theories are more interested or more focused on psychological traits rather than environmental conditions. So what are psychological traits and what are environmental conditions? Remember, environmental conditions, things that are beyond our control, they are outside of our body. So for instance, when we experience a depression or an economic collapse, psychosocial theories would not necessarily be focused on how that economic collapse pushed those individual or that individual into committing crime. A psychosocial theorist wouldn't necessarily be interested in how the neighborhood that one was brought up in influenced that person or those persons into committing crime or becoming part of a criminal lifestyle, etc. Whereas psychological traits, right, which we will discuss actually when we get to Dugdale and Goddard, are things that, deal with the personality, that deal with biology, etc. Okay? Early theories in the psychological tradition strongly emphasize 2 major traits contributing to criminal behavior. Those 2 traits are known as the great pillars of psychology. Your book will also refer to them as the 2 great pillars of differential psychology. Those are intelligence and temperament. Okay, and individuals involved in those, right, assume that low intelligence hampers the ability to calculate the pleasures and pains involved in undertaking criminal activity, and that certain types of temperament make individuals impulsive and also very difficult to socialize, okay? So 2 individuals that you guys need to be aware of when it comes to the development of these great pillars of psychology are Richard Dugdale and Henry Goddard. I'm going to start off with the way the book lists them. So I'm going to start off with Richard Dugdale. Okay. Again, so moving on to Dugdale, Richard Dugdale. So he was one of the earliest individuals to really emphasize low intelligence, low IQ, not necessarily low IQ, but low intelligence. So we need to refer, when we refer to Dugdale, we need to refer to his work, The Jukes. The Jukes, where he studied the lineage of a rural upstate New York family known for its criminal activity, to which he gave the fictitious names, again, the Jukes, okay? In that, he traced the family lineage to a colonial era character named Max, whose descendants remained in relative isolation and largely propagated themselves through intermarriage. Dugdale's work was widely interpreted as evidence of hereditary nature of criminality, although Dugdale himself believed that moral education could override biological propensity, okay? So what does all of that mean? So our textbook like specifically says that Dugdale eventually traced 1,200 of Mac's descendants, amongst whom he found numerous cases of crime. Some of this crime was pauperism, sexual immorality, promiscuity, prostitution, etc. And through all of that, again, Dugdale still believed that moral education could override anyone's biological propensities. So although we might have been born into this, in this lineage, right, this bloodline, right, education could help and override all of that. Okay, so our next individual is Goodard. Okay, so he's also another early study. Specifically, the book that he is well known for is based on Martin Sr. I'm not going to murk the last name, but Martin Sr.'s Family, a study on the heredity of feeble-mindedness. This study traced two family lineages of a Revolutionary War soldier named Martin Sr., who dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl whom he fathered a son. Okay, so that's one. Okay, and he produced another line of descendants with a woman from a good Quaker family whom he married. Okay, from these two families with a common male ancestor and two female ancestors, one defective and the other respectable. So the respectable one, the Quaker woman, and the defective one was the feeble-minded tavern girl. Goodard concluded that degeneracy was the result of a bad bloodline. Again, similar to Dugdale's finding, right? Bad blood, okay, was the reasoning as to why these individuals followed a criminal pathway, okay? Why these families followed a criminal pathway. If you were born into a good bloodline, then there was no issue. But the difference between Dugdale and Goodard was that Dugdale believed that, you know, education was the key to solve all of these issues, okay? Whereas Goodard didn't really state any belief at the end, but he found what he found, okay? Now let's move on to intelligence, okay? Intelligence is measured by IQ tests of various kinds. IQ tests are used to test for mental abilities and disabilities, educational placements, and job assignments, okay? Intelligence tests, for those that don't know what IQ stands for, is intelligence quotient, okay? David Welcher's definition, okay, he defined intelligence as the aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with his or her environment. Most studies of intelligence today look at the brain and genes thought to be associated with the speed and accuracy of information processing. But this complicated line of research needs not concern us, we're not concerned with it, okay? There are environmental effects on education as well, so let's not forget that. The most important evidence of environmental effects on IQ involves the so-called Flynn effect, okay? So what is the Flynn effect? Flynn has shown that the average IQ increased in populations in all developed countries studied by approximately 3.1 points per decade from 1932 to 2000. Flynn claims that the direct genetic effect on IQs is only about 36% as opposed to much higher estimates claimed by others, with 64% resulting from the indirect effects of genes interacting with the environment. Genes are usually matched with environments. So high IQ genes with advantaged environments and low IQ genes with disadvantaged environments that multiply or magnify what may have been a small genetic advantage or disadvantage at birth into large advantage or disadvantages over time. Dickens and Flynn. So Dickens and, let me just, yeah, okay. Dickens and Flynn go on to say that the better environments to which successive generations have been exposed has allowed the potency of the environmental factors to stand out in bold relief. Next, our book goes on to IQ crime connection, okay? The IQ crime relationship is stronger than often indicated because most IQ studies lump together boys who commit only minor delinquent acts during their teenage years with boys who will continue to offend into adulthood. Simple arithmetic tells us that pooling these two groups hides the magnitude of IQ difference between non-offenders and serious offenders if the latter have lower IQs than the former. Most studies, so most IQ studies, look at full-scale IQ, okay, which is obtained by averaging the scores verbal IQ, the VIQ, and performance IQ, PIQ subscales. Most verbal IQ measures language, communication, and working memory aptitude, while performance IQ measures problem solving and abstract thinking skills. Okay, so know the difference between verbal IQ and also performance IQ. This PIQ, VIQ discrepancy is called intellectual imbalance, which provides another example of how the role of IQ in understanding criminal behavior may be underestimated if we rely solely on full-scale IQ rather than looking deeper into the effects of verbal IQ only or PIQ, VIQ imbalances. Academic achievement is a measure of IQ plus many other personal and situational characteristics, such as conscientious study habits, ambition, supportive parents, talent, and effort. IQ is related to a wide range of life outcomes that are themselves related to criminal and antisocial behavior, such as poverty, lack of education, and unemployment. Now let's move on to temperament and personality. Many early psychological criminologists saw criminal behavior as a result of the interaction of low intelligence and a particular kind of temperament. Temperament is defined as constitutionally based individual differences in reactivity and self-regulation influenced over time by genes, maturation, and experience. It is a person's habitual mode of emotionally responding to stimuli and is largely a function of genes governing physiological arousal patterns, although arousal systems are fine-tuned by experience. Okay. Temperamental differences make some children easy to socialize and others difficult to socialize. Numerous studies have shown that parents, teachers, and peers respond to children with bad temperaments negatively, and that such children, so those children that are receiving these negative reactions from parents, peers, etc., these children find acceptance only in association with others similar to their dispositions. Okay. There is a figure on page 166. I have incorporated in this slide. It is a figure of the impact of high and low IQs on selective outcomes. Pause the video here and just view it. Again, it's in relation to temperament and personality, specifically how IQ level will influence one's social behavior. So take a moment and pause the video here and then continue on. So moving on to Sigmund Freud, modern psychology and personality, okay? In regards to personality, Personality is an individual's set of relatively enduring and functionally integrated psychological characteristics that results from his or her temperament interacting with cultural and developmental experiences. Freud offered a broad, sweeping theory of personality, and although he wrote little about crime, his ideas stimulated many criminologists. According to Freud, the basic human personality consists of three interacting components, each having separate purposes: the id, the ego, and the superego. Okay? The id is the biological raw material of our temperament and personality. It represents our drives and instincts for acquiring life-sustaining necessities and life's pleasures. That's the id. Okay. The ego obeys the reality principle because it realizes that the desires and demands of the id are necessary, but they must be satisfied in socially appropriate ways if one is to avoid any negative consequences. The superego strives for the ideal and is thus just as irrational as the id. It represents all the moral and social rules internalized by the person during the process of socialization and may be summed up as the conscience. Okay. The normal personality is one in which the ego is successful in working out compromises between its irrational partners. Continuing on with Sigmund Freud, not Freud's, sorry. An abnormal personality results when either the id or the superego overwhelms the ego, resulting in psychic energy being drained from the weaker components to strengthen the stronger components. Okay. The ocean model consists of the big five personality traits. These 5 traits make up the bulk of who we are as a person and include openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Okay, those are the big 5 personality traits. Okay, so now moving on to personality traits positively and negatively associated with criminal behavior. The first one is impulsiveness. Impulsiveness is perhaps the trait most often linked to criminal behavior. Impulsiveness is the tendency to act without giving much thought to the consequences or what may happen afterward. The next one is negative emotionality. Negative emotionality refers to the tendency to experience many situations as aversive and to react to them with irritation and anger more readily than with positive affective states. The third one is sensation seeking. Sensation seeking refers to the active desire for novel, varied, and risky sensations. This is by a study done by Zuckerman in 1990. Sensation seekers tend to be outgoing and relatively impulsive and also very fearless. Our next one is empathy. Empathy is the emotional and cognitive ability to understand the feelings and distress of others as if they were your own. Okay. Altruism. This next one. Altruism can be thought of as the action component of empathy. If you feel empathy for someone, you will probably feel motivated to take some sort of action to alleviate his or her distress if you are able. The next one is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is a primary trait composed of several secondary traits such as well-organized, disciplined, scrupulous, responsible, and reliable at one pole, and disorganized, careless, unreliable, irresponsible, and unscrupulous at the other. And then next, agreeableness. Agreeableness is the tendency to be friendly, considerate, courteous, helpful, and cooperative with others. Agreeable persons tend to trust others, to compromise with them, and to empathize with them, as well as to aid them. Our book then goes on to discuss conscience and arousal, okay? So a conscience is a complex mix of emotional and cognitive mechanisms acquired by internalizing the moral rules of our social group during socialization. People with strong consciences feel guilt, shame, stress, and anxiety when they violate or even contemplate violating these rules. Automatic nervous system, the automatic nervous system, ANS, is part of the peripheral nervous system that carries out the basic housekeeping functions of the body by funneling messages from the environment to various internal organs, the physiological basis of the conscience, okay? The ANS, which is again is the acronym for automatic nervous system, the ANS has two complementary branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. When an organism perceives a threat, the brain sends signals to the sympathetic branch to mobilize the body for vigorous action. This is the fight or flight reaction. Pupils will dilate for better vision, the heart and the lungs will accelerate their activity, and digestion stops, amongst other things, all of which are aided by pumping epinephrine or adrenaline, okay? The parasympathetic system restores the body to homeostasis after the organism perceives that the threat is over or is done with, okay? Operant and classical conditioning. Operant conditioning going first, right? Operant conditioning is active and cognitive in that it forms a conscious association between a person's behavior and its consequences. Classical conditioning, on the other hand, is mostly passive and visceral. It simply forms a subconscious association between two paired stimuli, okay? Individuals with a readily aroused ANS, and again, ANS refers back to the automatic nervous system, so individuals with a readily aroused ANS are easily socialized. They learn their moral lessons well because ANS arousal is subjectively experienced as fear and anxiety. But people with ANS resistant to arousal will not experience anxiety and fear. Individuals with relatively unresponsive ANS are difficult to socialize because they experience little fear, little shame, little guilt when they are offended, even when discovered and are punished. Variations in physiological measures will therefore be more important in accounting for antisocial behavior among higher socioeconomic status individuals than in lower socioeconomic status SES individuals, whose physiological risks are masked by physiological risk factors. This is consistently found and has been called the social push hypothesis. Okay, and again, pause here at this section. This is just a figure. Again, this can be found in your book on page 170. This is the functions of the automatic nervous system. So we're not a biology class here, we're not an anatomy class here, but it is important to learn how the brain and the body react to shame, to guilt, to all of these things, okay? So pause here. Moving on to cognitive arousal, the reticular activating system can be thought of as the brain's filter system determining what incoming stimuli the higher brain centers will pay attention to. Arousal theory states that humans have varying internal thermostats, which explains why people differ on the levels of arousal or stimulation they need to feel comfortable. Some individuals possess an RAS, okay, reticular activating system, that is highly sensitive to incoming stimuli. These people are known as augmenters, and others possess one that is unusually insensitive. These people are known as reducers. Augmenters tend to be people with hyperactive ANSs, and reducers tend to be people with hypoactive ANSs. Under-arousal of the ANS is associated with fearlessness, and under-arousal of the RAS is associated with sensation-seeking. Reducers are easily bored with levels of stimulation that are just right for most of us and continually seek to boost stimuli to more comfortable levels. RAS reducers are chronically bored and seek to increase stimuli to alleviate that boredom. This may result in criminal behavior. So RAS, arousal, is important to understand criminal behavior. Although people differ greatly in their behavior depending on their innate temperaments, a function of arousal levels, their developmental and other environmental experiences also play a huge part. This figure can be found on page 172 in your textbook. It's the schematic image of the brain showing various parts. And you can pause here at this section, but do recall that we just went over the cognitive arousal system. So while you pause, please have this figure open and just think about how certain types of stimuli might interact with different parts of the brain, okay? So you can pause here. Moving on to Glenn Walter's lifestyle theory, okay? Criminal behavior is part of a general pattern of life, okay? Or a lifestyle characterized by irresponsibility, impulsiveness, self-indulgence, negative interpersonal relationships, and the chronic willingness to violate society's rule. A criminal lifestyle is the result of choices criminals make within the limits established by our early and current biological and environmental conditions. Walters stresses, okay, impulsiveness and low IQ as the most important choice biasing conditions at the individual level, and stresses attachment to significant others as the most important environmental condition. Okay, so lifestyle theory, again, is a result of choices to Walters, okay? So let me just reiterate it again. So a criminal's lifestyle is the result of choices criminals make within the limits established by our early and current biological environmental conditions. Walters again stresses impulsiveness and low IQ as the most important choice biasing conditions at the individual level, and stresses attachment to significant others as the most important environmental condition. Cognition refers to cognitive styles people develop as a consequence of their condition and the patterns of choices they have made in response to them. According to this theory, criminals display 8 major cognitive features or thinking errors that make them what they are. These thinking errors lead to 4 interrelated behavioral patterns or styles that almost guarantee criminality, okay? These are rule breaking, interpersonal, intrusiveness, self-indulgence, rule breaking, interpersonal intrusiveness, self-indulgence, and irresponsibility, okay? Thinking errors are criminals' typical pattern of faulty thoughts and beliefs. According to this theory, criminals display 8 major cognitive features or thinking errors that make them what they are. Examples, so this is direct quote from Walter's textbook, examples of criminals' thinking errors are cut off, the ability to discount the suffering of their victims, entitlement, which is the world owes them a living, power orientation, so these criminals viewing the world in terms of weakness and strength, cognitive indolence, so it's an orientation to the present concrete in thinking, and discontinuity, which is the inability to integrate thinking patterns. Little can be done to change criminal behavior until criminals change their pattern of thinking. Okay, going into antisocial personalities. The first one we're going to go into is psychopathy. We use the genetic term psychopathy as a syndrome we can define as being characterized psychologically by egocentricity, deceitfulness, manipulativeness, selfishness, and a lack of empathy, guilt, or remorse. Psychopathy can also be characterized physiologically by the inability to tie the brain areas associated with the social emotions and rational cognition together. Others view psychopathy not as something one is or isn't, but rather simply a name we apply to the most serious and chronic criminal offenders. Psychiatrists apply the label Antisocial Personality Disorder, so ASPD, to such criminals. ASPD is defined by the American Psychiatric Association, specifically in 1994, as a pervasive pattern of disregard and violation of the rights of others that begin in childhood or early adolescence and continues into adulthood. Okay. The most widely used measure of psychopathy is the psychopathy checklist. So specifically the psychopathy checklist revised. So PCLR, which was devised by Robert Hare, the leading expert in psychopathy in the world today. Okay. Hare, specifically in 1993, considers psychopathy to be primarily a biological phenomenon. So it's primarily biological in origin. He states that I can find no convincing evidence that psychopathy is the direct result of early social or environmental factors. Okay. Psychopaths behave exactly as they were designed to behave. Modern researchers no longer talk of criminals as evolutionary throwbacks whose behavior is unnatural. Rather, they view psychopaths as behaving exactly as they were designed by natural selection to behave. This does not mean that their behavior is acceptable or that we cannot consider it morally pathological and punish it accordingly. One of the most consistent psychological findings about psychopaths is their greatly reduced ability to experience the social emotion of shame, embarrassment, guilt, and empathy. Hundreds of studies using many different methods have revealed over and over that defining characteristic of psychopaths is their inability to tie the brain's cognitive and emotional networks together and thus form a conscience. Okay? So psychopaths can't form a conscience. Okay. Here, this figure is taken from your textbook on page 174. It is a table of personality and behavioral traits measured by Hare. Okay, so do pause here and go through them. Okay, again, these are personality and behavioral traits measured by Robert Hare. Okay, so it's the psychopathy checklist revised. So you can pause here. So moving on to sociopathy. All sociopaths are criminals. All sociopaths are criminal by definition. The development of sociopathy is not as closely tied to genetics as it is in psychopaths, but is developed primarily through inadequate socialization and hostile childhood experiences. Lycan describes sociopaths as feral creatures, undomesticated predators, stowaways on our communal voyage who have never signed a social contract. Their behavior is traceable to deviant learning histories, interacting perhaps with deviant genetic predilections. His quotes, exactly. Families headed by single mothers with children fathered by different men were found to specifically put offspring most at risk for antisocial behavior. Two-parent families with full siblings placed offspring at the lowest risks. Okay. Moving now on to mental illness and crime. While psychopaths and sociopaths may be morally insane, they are not mentally ill. Individuals with mental disorders are mentally impaired and pose risks for criminal behavior. Mental health disorders take a heavy toll on individuals, families, the community at large, and the criminal justice system. Jails and prisons have become a surrogate type of mental hospitals, absorbing members of the mentally ill population who were previously hospitalized. The World Health Organization defines mental disorders as clinically significant conditions characterized by alterations in thinking, mood/emotions, or behavior associated with personal distress and or impaired function. Schizophrenia is the disorder most strongly associated with criminal behavior. A Swedish study reported that people with psychosis are about 4 times more likely to have criminal record than members of the general population. Okay. Bogan and Johnson, okay, assert that there is a simplistic as well as inaccurate, it's simplistic as well as inaccurate to say the cause of violence amongst mentally ill individuals is a mental illness itself. Others maintain that a modest but significant relationship exists between violence and mental illness, independent of these factors. Okay. The abuse of alcohol and drugs may be an attempt to self-medicate, which then may lead to dependence, putting persons with schizophrenia at even a greater risk of offending. A majority of people with schizophrenia are nonviolent and are more likely to be victims of violence than the perpetrators themselves. The most at risk for victimization are also those most at risk for committing violence. Okay. Now moving on to our last section of chapter 9 is the evaluation of psychosocial perspectives, okay? So let me pause here. So now moving on to the evaluation of the psychosocial perspective, Adler, Mueller, and Laufer voiced the familiar criticism that IQ tests are culturally biased, despite the findings of the National Academy of Sciences and the APA's Task Force on Intelligence cited earlier in our textbook. One of the most pervasive criticisms of psychological theories is that they focus on defective or abnormal personalities. If by abnormal we mean statistical abnormality, all theories of criminality focus on abnormality. Lifestyle theory emphasizes that criminals are at the extremes of normal distributions of many traits, but focus mainly on how criminals think as a result of their biological constitutions and earlier experiences. Okay. The use of hard measuring instruments to measure ANS and RAS, arousal, provides us with a more accurate prediction about future offending than simple paper and pencil methods. The influence of these arousal mechanisms are strongly conditioned by the social environment. There is always some risk in attaching a psychiatric label to individuals as well. Here specifically is a figure that you can find on page 179 in your textbook. Again, it's the evaluation of psychosocial perspectives around the theories of arousal, lifestyle, and antisocial personality, the key concepts of strengths and positions. I would pause here. Definitely, if any of you are taking notes, this is definitely one that you should screenshot or take notes of. So pause here, look at this, specifically its key concepts. In there, you will also find definitions of the theories. So pause, take a screenshot, etc. Okay. And our last section is on policy and prevention, the implications of psychosocial theories. Because policies aimed at the root cause, have had little impact on the crime problem in the past, perhaps it is wise to focus on efforts on those who are already committing crimes rather than on conditions external to them. There is a wide disagreement on how well rehabilitative programs work and even on the criteria for their success. Reviews of studies with strict criteria for determining success find recidivism rates lowered by 8%, 8 to 10%. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is an effective treatment that addresses the thinking errors that lead to negative emotionality, furthering a pattern of problematic behavior. Effective cognitive effective cognitive styles help put people on a pro-social path, changing their pattern of behavior. And in regards to psychopaths are poor candidates for treatment. Hare in 1993 states that because they are largely incapable of empathy, warmth, and sincerity needed to develop an effective treatment relationship, treatment often makes them worse because they learn how to better push people's button rather than fixing their own behavior. Old age seems to be the only cure for the behaviors associated with this particular psychopath syndrome. Okay, so that is it for our, I'm sorry for that noise, but that's it for our lecture, okay? So I'm gonna upload this now and you have chapter 9, so please prepare yourself for the first exam. Chapters 1 through 5 and 9. I'll see you guys later, bye.